First of all, I want to thank you all for joining us today. And we're looking forward to a really wonderful webinar this afternoon. We have some outstanding guests to join all of us. Thank you for joining us today for History Right on Your Campus, Preserving HBCUs, which is part of our 2022 webinar series, Preserve the Past, Build for the Future. We're recording this session and it will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. I'm Susan Glimsher. I'm the Director of Communications, Education, and Outreach for the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. The ACHP is an independent federal agency that promotes the economic, educational, environmental, and cultural values of historic preservation. We also advise the President and Congress on national historic preservation policy. The ACHP also influences federal activities, programs, and policies that affect historic and cultural properties. Our agency is comprised of 24 statutory members, and we are the only federal agency whose sole mission is historic preservation. A large part of the ACHP's work is overseeing Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Section 106 requires federal agencies and anyone receiving federal funding or licensure to consider historic preservation when carrying out an undertaking. This webinar and the rest of the series fulfills several aspects of our mission to educate the public about the benefits and the background of historic preservation, bringing young people into this field, and building a more inclusive preservation program. We have had and continue to have a really great lineup for this year's series. All of our webinars are on Wednesday at 3 p.m. We've hosted 3 of our 5 webinars for 2023 so far, and we have one more after today, and we really hope you'll join us for that. So coming up on May 24th is Hallowed Ground, Preserving Historic Black Churches. And you can register for that webinar at the registration link that we are putting in the chat right now. You can also find the recordings of all of our past webinars on our website, and we will also add that link to the chat as well. We're excited about our guests for today. They are Dr. Cynthia Warrick, the president of Stillman College, Tuscaloosa, Alabama. She will talk about her historic campus and the efforts to restore one of their oldest buildings, Winsboro Hall, which I believe was built in 1922. Dr. Warrick will correct me on that if I'm wrong. Dana Chandler. Dana is the Tuskegee University archivist, and Dana will talk about the amazing effort to preserve Tuskegee's historic campus and its history. And Molly Baker, the project manager for the HOPE Crew, which stands for Hands-on Preservation Experience. I'm sorry, Molly, I drew a blank. And she is at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Molly will talk to us about the work the HOPE Crew has done on HBCU campuses and how HBCUs can utilize volunteers for preservation projects. And if you have not read about the HOPE Crew at the National Trust, I highly recommend that you look it up. It's a great, great group. Before we begin, if you have any questions or comments during this webinar, please put them in the chat box. Once the speakers have given their presentations, my colleague Lynn Richmond will pose your questions to the speakers. Now let's begin. Dr. Warrick, welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm always excited about talking about Winsboro Hall. So I am the president of Stillman College, and the campus is a National Register Historic District. It's also, when I got there, they had just, the state of Alabama had made the campus a historic landmark for the state. And then we had the opportunity to work on the application for the National Register of Historic Places We have 3 historic sites in the National Register: Shepherd Library, Snedeker Hall, and then Winnsboro Hall is what I'll talk with you today about. Winnsboro Hall was built by Hallie Paxson Winnsboro. She was the director of the Presbyterian Women's Auxiliary at the Presbyterian Presbyterian Churches of the United States of America, PCUSA, back in the early 1900s. And Mrs. Winnsboro was really a force to reckon with. She was much about civil rights and social justice, and especially rights for women. This is how Winnsboro looks today. As you can see, it's in a lot of trouble, and we are currently in the fundraising to restore this property. Next slide. And this is Hallie Paxson Winnsboro. And she was the first woman who was the director of the Women's Auxiliary of the Presbyterian Church. And in 1922, she organized a Presbyterian Women's Birthday Offering of 1 penny of each year of their age every month. They contributed, and that fund, I think it's $1 for every year that they contribute to the Presbyterian Women's Birthday Offering, and that's still in existence today. Next slide. So Ms. Winnsboro was very interested in civil rights, and especially elevating the status of women. And she felt that Negro women really needed to have workshops and needed their status elevated, and wanted to do these leadership conferences. And so she established the first conference for Negro women in 1916, and it was on the campus of Stillman College. And in that time, Stillman was still an all-male religious education school. This first conference, she invited women from all over, and they had 155 women from 16 different towns in 6 different states. It's the first conference of any denomination specifically for African American women. Next slide. And so when they got there, and they were staying in the men's dormitory, and in the second year, and they had this annual conference every year for 10 years while Mrs. Winnsboro was still living, and it spurred similar Negro women's conferences at HBCUs across the South. They decided that, well, where are the women? And that's when they said they would start a women's school. And in 1922, they finished Winnsboro Hall. The first floor was where they received instruction, because women were not integrated into the classes with the guys yet. And then the second and third floors were the dormitories of this 3-story building. Next slide. She also felt that healthcare was important. And she says, well, where do African Americans get their health care? Because they couldn't go to the hospital in Tuscaloosa. So with the birthday offering fund of $42,500 in 1929, she built the Snedeker Hall, which is right behind Winnsboro Hall. And it was the first Negro hospital in Tuscaloosa, and provided the first nurses training school in Tuscaloosa for African American women. Next slide. And then when you dial down to the 60s, Winnsboro Hall became very prominent because it was the home, the residence of Vivian Malone Jones as she integrated the University of Alabama. So as you can see, Vivian, along with James Hood, and escorted by the National Guard, had to forcefully enter the University of Alabama. The presidents of Stillman and the University of Alabama got together to have a peaceful integration, but Governor Wallace decided otherwise. And so you had this big confrontation. That's why they scheduled it for June when most students were not on campus. And so then the university hired a driver, a student from Stillman, to take Miss Jones to and from, well, Malone at that point, to and from her classes at the university, and she resided in Winsboro Hall. She graduated with honors, but was not able to get a job in Alabama, anywhere in Alabama. And so Robert Kennedy was able to get her a job with the Social Security Administration in Washington. She kept in touch with the driver, who was Mac Jones. They ended up marrying. He went to medical school at Emory University and graduated. They married and lived in Atlanta. And Vivian Malone Jones became the first director of the Environmental Justice Office in Atlanta, Georgia, for EPA. And so so this building is also historic in that sense. Next slide. This is how it will look after it's fully restored, and we are converting Winsboro Hall into the Winsboro Living and Learning Center. We're going to convert this female dormitory from a residence hall for students into apartments for senior citizens. And it's an $8.9 million project. We've raised these funds thus far and waiting on a grant from the HUD 202 program to subsidize the seniors for this housing. And that's all I have. Waiting for the questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warrick. The plan is to have all of our speakers present first, and then we'll take the questions. So thank you for that wonderful history. I was actually unaware of some of that, and so I have already made a note to look it up in Google. We really appreciate that information. So now let's welcome Dana Chandler from Tuskegee University.
This is the Tuskegee University website, archives website. We have had over 2 million hits in the past 9 years. And that has proven to be one of the best ways for us to get information out to the world about our important buildings, our architects, information about Tuskegee overall. Tuskegee, as many of you know, began in 1881, July 4th, 1881. Many of our buildings, initial buildings, were designed by Robert R. Taylor, the first African-American to graduate from MIT with an architect's degree, and the first certified African-American architect. And our architect, many of the buildings were built by students, including the brick, everything from the brick being made and put up to the electrical later on and the plumbing, etc. Because our university has 20 buildings on the historic registry, our campus is a historic site, a national historic site, and tours are given on a daily basis of the university. The buildings that we have are in a variety of stages of repair and disrepair. We are working diligently to repair some of the buildings right now. We were able to work on Tompkins Hall, and that's Tompkins Hall right there. What was really interesting about this project was that some of the woodwork on the inside of that dome right there that sat on top of the building was completed by freed slaves that did most of the construction with the wood. Some of the beams were 3 feet wide, 4 feet high. And it was an amazing thing to see when we renovated it all of the woodwork that was in that building. The construction of the building itself must have been some undertaking. We have photographs, which is another important part of our archives and why it is here, of buildings under construction, showing them setting up the process for making beams and bricks, etc. It's really pretty cool. Because Tuskegee is working diligently, like many other HBCUs, to repair our buildings, we're trying to maintain the same general look, or to return them or restore them to their original look, which can be difficult, especially when you're trying to match up things. Right now, the Oaks is being renovated, which is the home of Booker T. Washington. It's the first house on campus to have, and first house in Macon County to have electricity. 1957, excuse me, our chapel burned, the original chapel burned. And what happened with that chapel being burned is that we lost a lot of things, in particular our singing windows. And that in itself was devastating to many people. When we rebuilt the building in 1976, because we wanted to restore those singing windows, we decided we were going to use photographs. We contacted the original company that provided them, and they had everything, the original design, original color palette, everything, and were able to match perfectly the singing windows that we have today in the newer building from the old building. So our objective at Tuskegee has been to restore as close to the original as we can. And we have some wonderful buildings, just like many of the HBCUs, beautiful woodwork on the interior, beautiful accessories to the buildings. When we did repaired the Sports Hall of Fame, Logan Hall. Outside of Logan Hall, there were these sconces, and we were able to save those sconces and replace them, and to match them up. The sconces were originally housing lighting that was done by gas flame, and we're able to make them electric and bring them up to using modern technology, but nonetheless to keep that look. And it really has been impressive. So when you drive around the campus of Tuskegee today, and many people say it's one of the most beautiful campuses they've ever been to, and I agree. Of course, I'm a little prejudiced about that. You see buildings that are some newer buildings, but you see many of our older buildings that we've tenderly renovated, put new roofs on, and some, of course, that don't exist anymore at all. And I firmly am convinced that as HBCUs, we need to take it upon ourselves, get as many photographs as we can of the interior and exterior buildings. Number one. Number two, the original drawings. Now, we've been very fortunate that the folks at the physical plant have kept many of the original drawings. In fact, some of the drawings that were made by Robert Taylor, and we're able to utilize them in our renovations on campus. We found some mistakes that were made. One building in particular in Tanham Hall that they had mistakenly set the stories, the 3-story building, and made it a 4-story building when it should have been a 3-story building. So there are a lot of things that we are able to do utilizing the original drawings, the original photographs, the write-ups that we had in the catalogs. All those things come to play to help us to restore these buildings so that they look like they were originally built. And that's, I think, is very important. As an archivist, as somebody that's interested in restoring buildings, that's important to me and to my staff. And so we take great pride in trying to put this together and provide this website that people can utilize to see what we did have. Since this website's been up, we've been able to add a walking trail throughout the 20 buildings. And you can actually see now 3D representations of each of the buildings. And you can also access the original photographs, the drawings when we had them, if we had them. And I think that what we see in the future here at Tuskegee is a continuation of restoration of these buildings, and renovation, but not tearing them down and building something in its place that looks totally out of place here on campus. So I encourage the HBCUs that are listening, those that are listening, that are interested in renovations and restorations, to spend the time and develop a good source of information like our website is, to be able to access this information when allowing the administration the opportunity to utilize this information to make these buildings what they should be.
Thank you so much, Dana. We already have some questions for you guys. And, I love Tuskegee, you know that, of course, and we'll be so interested to hear a little bit more from you about the history of the campus, because, of course, it's pretty impressive the way the students and the president actually built part of it themselves. So now we will turn to Molly Baker from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here with y'all today. Let me just share my screen here. Can you see that yet?
We can.
Fantastic. Great. As Susan mentioned, I work for the National Trust for Historic Building Preservation, and specifically the HOPE Crew program. I'll tell you a little bit more about the trust and a broader overview of HOPE Crew before I get into what I'm so excited to talk about is our HBCU initiative. So first, who are the National Trust? Let's see. Now I'm having trouble advancing my slides too. Let's see. There we go. The National Trust for Historic Preservation is the largest national nonprofit advocating for historic building preservation. We were formed by an act of Congress with the purpose of becoming self-sufficient after a matter of time and being able to advocate for preservation. But what does that actually mean? We operate by 4 main tenets. 1, to save America's historic places. 2, to tell the full American story. 3, to assist in building stronger communities, and 4, to invest in preservation's future. We do this by means of many programs, and here are just a few. I encourage you to go to savingplaces.org to learn about all of the wonderful things that we're doing at the Trust. A couple that I wanted to highlight, though, one is our African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. To date, on its 5-year anniversary, they've been able to raise $80 million to support telling the full American story and celebrating places of African American significance and history. Another program is the 11 Most Endangered Historic Places. I mention that because it's a great way for anybody to nominate a space that is important to them and seek out advocacy for support to save these places. That comes with technical assistance, funding, grant funds, and great publicity for the site. Additionally, I mention that because HBCUs were placed on the 11 most endangered list a number of years ago, and by means of partnership with the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, there has been a dedicated funding source called a campus stewardship initiative that's dedicated to supporting the heritage of HBCUs. The last one I want to mention is the Mildred Kolodny Diversity Scholarship. This is a great way for students to further their education through seeking graduate degrees in historic preservation or preservation-related fields. It comes with an internship at the National Trust, time in DC, which is great for networking, and funds to help support your education. And that brings me to the Hope Crew program. Again, we're formed by the National Trust, and our acronym is Hands-On Preservation Experience. We're a two-person team. I serve as manager alongside our program director, Milan Jordan. And we were formed with the goal of bringing preservation trades and preservation knowledge and experience to a younger and more diverse audience. Since our formation in 2014, we've worked to support $19 million worth of preservation work. We've engaged 3,700 volunteers. We've trained and worked alongside 800 paid participants, and we've completed projects at 190 historic sites across the country, including the U.S. territories. We have three primary models in which we work. Our first one is an introduction to trades, preservation trades. That could include anything from carpentry, roofing, window restoration, stained glass conservation, masonry, cemetery work, documentation projects, which we'll get into a little bit more here in a bit. And for each one of our models, I thought I'd highlight one of our projects. For this one, I wanted to highlight the African House project. African House is located in rural Louisiana, and it was originally constructed by enslaved labor, and it's truly a one-of-a-kind structure. The project allowed us to not only marvel at the construction methods, but to learn and teach the original timber framing techniques that were used to construct the building. And in doing so, I feel like it was a really great way to honor the original builders. Our participants, we had about 8 participants that learned historic timber framing methods, and it was a really successful project. Our next model is our volunteer model. This allows us to engage with communities and work on large-scale, low-scale projects. And I really love this example of Hinchcliffe Stadium. This is one of the last remaining Negro League baseball stadiums in the country. And we put a call out to the community for a cleanup and painting day. And we aspired to get maybe 50 or 70 volunteers. 700 people showed up. We were thrilled. It really shows how important this building is to the community. In one day, the structure was completely cleaned and painted, and it inspired the city to reinvest in this space by seeing how much the community loved it. To date, they've used redevelopment dollars, $102 million, to create restaurants, housing for seniors, a daycare center, and the coolest part is a museum to celebrate the National Negro League Baseball group. The last one, which I'm so excited to share with you, is our newest initiative, and it is our HBCU initiative. And we have several ways in which we've worked with HBCUs. Our first way was a really great partner program, or is a really great partner program called Preservation in Practice, in which we work with the National Park Service and the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation. This program grew out of a plea to address the disparity in the number of licensed architects of color and the low number of practicing architects, architectural preservationists of color. We, in our first year, worked with Morgan State University, and the second year expanded to include Tuskegee University. It was really cool to hear Dana talk about some of the work there at Tuskegee. We were able to work on the Wilcox B building doing window restoration. So some of the windows that he mentioned in his presentation, we were actually able to work on. We expanded from just hands-on training, though, to include things like documentation. Another thing that Dana touched on that's so important to preserving HBCUs is having good documentation. And I'll touch on a little bit more how we've expanded our program to include that. So during the pandemic, Hope Crew began to look for ways to continue to engage HBCU architecture and design students. But we were really, trying to dig deep to think how we could do that in a meaningful way and in a virtual world. In our search, we found the logical intersection being documentation. A crucial part of cataloging and celebrating places of African American significance is to do documentation. Through this project, we worked with 3 students who never met in person. They worked together virtually, and they were able to create a 3D model out of point cloud data that had been collected, a website, and submit a board to the Library of Congress's Holland Prize. This project really inspired us to look at the technological aspect of preservation. We loved what this layer of the technological focus added to the program. So we continued to explore new technologies when we were able to meet in person once again. Our partnership with the University of District Columbia allowed us to explore this further. We worked with their Black Land Loss seminar course to teach ground penetrating radar, GPR scanning, and it was used on a park that had been built over a Black burial ground in Chevy Chase, DC. Additionally, we used this technology and expanded on it at the Mount Zion Female Union Band Cemetery, and also explored use of photogrammetry to document illegible and damaged headstones. In 2022, we were able to expand the Digital Documentation Fellowship by means of the Action Fund's Campus Stewardship Initiative. This expansion in the first year allowed us to work with 5 fellows from 3 universities, and it allowed us to give each of them the tools they needed to design, lead, and execute a project on their campus or in their campus community. Our first fellow was Jordan. He's a student from Tuskegee University, and he used 3D scanning and modeling to assist a pre-Rosenwald school in the county that Tuskegee is located in, but helped them to save the building ultimately by doing documentation. It was also part of a greater plan to get the building listed on the register and eventually to have the building restored. He was able to engage his fellow classmates in this project, and it was just really cool to see how the community came together to support Jordan's project and how much it benefited their work. Our second fellow was Gabby. She assisted the Olivewood Cemetery in Houston, one of the first incorporated Black burial grounds in the city of Houston, and also an 11 Most nominee. She helped them by creating an app and a brand book for their site. The app was a framework to document the headstones so that people could search for those who were buried there. And the branding book helps to spread the word about their good work by means of a logo and a whole brand scheme that they were able to use on their website. Our second fellow from, what school? Prairie View A&M was Latavia. And Latavia, she was a student in the architecture program, and she helped to create signage and a map for a cemetery on campus that is thought to be the final resting place of up to 1,000 enslaved individuals. Unfortunately, despite the large amount of people buried here or suspected to be buried here, only a handful of gravestones exist. And so she created a design competition with her classmates to create signage to honor the memory of those buried there and to tell the history of the site. And you can see some of the submissions there. Moving on to Florida A&M University, we worked with Cornelius. Cornelius did a project at John G. Riley House. John G. Riley was one of the first African-American millionaires in the state of Florida. He was a great philanthropist and supported his community through educational initiatives and through housing initiatives. What Cornelius did was use 3D scanning and modeling to engage fellow students in a cool project on site, and also submitted the house to the Library of Congress so that the catalog of places celebrating African-American history could be increased. As to date, that number is very low by comparison to the, other histories that are celebrated through the Library of Congress. Our last fellow is Joshua. Joshua led his classmates in a headstone cleaning project and also a GIS mapping of Old City Cemetery. The Old City Cemetery is adjacent to the FAMU campus, and is historically segregated. His research led to a really cool interactive tour of the site, celebrating those that are buried there, the lives of those that are buried there. The fellowship will continue over the next 3 years. It is a great way for HBCUs to get involved in hands-on projects on their campus, documentation projects. Also, it's in partnership with the HBCU Heritage initiative that the Action Fund is executing. So please go to the website, go to savingplaces.org and learn more about these initiatives. Additionally, we are happy to announce that we created a documentary for our inaugural year of the fellowship. It really highlights the work of our 2022 fellows and highlights the power of preservation when placed in the hands of students. I'm going to drop a link to the trailer in the chat. Please stay tuned for the launch of that documentary soon. It's really inspiring to see what students can do. I'm happy to answer any questions at the end here, but in the meantime, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Molly. Okay, so we really appreciate all of these great presentations, and we have had some very lively discussions in the Q&A and the chat, lots of questions for everyone. So I'm going to ask Lynn to take them on, and if the speakers would like to bring their cameras up, we'll start at the beginning and get through them all if possible. Great presentations, everyone. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you everybody for your great questions. We're going to try to get to every one of them, so I'm going to just plow right through them. First question, there's an abandoned HBCU which has about 3 very historic buildings left that are over 125 years old. Where would we begin? Where would they begin to get the funding to have these buildings repaired or restored for multi-purpose use for the community and to preserve the rich history of what was once a plantation? Dr. Warrick, would you be able to address that?
Yeah, it depends on the state and the and the campus. Whoever is the owner, the registered owner of the campus, would have to be engaged, and the State Historic Preservation Office would have to be engaged as well. It may need to be, for federal support, it will require it to be in the National Register of Historic Places, and the State Historic Office can provide support in order to develop that application. And so I think it's a worthwhile project, and hope you can reach out to the owners in the state.
And there's a similar question from Shakita.
Molly said she wanted to.
Yep, Molly will have something
Molly.
to say, and
Yeah.
actually I have
Sorry about that, Molly.
some thoughts as well after Molly.
Okay.
Molly, you're muted.
Oh.
I always say if I only had $1 for every time that sentence had been uttered in the last 3 years, I would be retiring. Yes.
Here you go.
Great. Again, I highly recommend going to the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund's page on savingplaces.org or through our grants on savingplaces.org. That sounds like a really great project that could be supported by means of those funds. Those grants are very straightforward to write. They were designed so that you don't have to be a professional grant writer to create the grant application. The next round, I believe, is December. Unfortunately, is a year wait for that, and we just went through our LOI process in the winter and the review of those applications just recently. But please stay tuned for that. That's a really great opportunity for a funding source for something like this.
And I would just like to add that there are so many grants out there that are available to help with these kinds of restoration and preservation work. And I have often heard that the biggest dilemma with regard to these grants is that there's so much money left on the table because people don't know about them. So for example, hold on one second, Dana. Other options for you that I can think of off the top of my head would be the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has numerous grants that can be used by HBCUs, including a challenge grant for restoration and preservation of buildings. that unfortunately is a match, but they will give up to $1 million, and they have smaller amounts as well. Also, the Institute for Museums and Library Services offer grants, and many federal agencies do offer grants. And for example, other options to explore just by Googling grants for HBCUs, even in the state of Maryland, Preservation Maryland has a heritage fund. There's the Maryland Historical Trust. And I think Molly would probably know better than I do whether Morgan State could apply for any or all of these. There's a Maryland Heritage Area Authority that has grants. Then, of course, there's the National Trust, which is hugely important. So I would just, even in Baltimore, there's neighborhood grants. So I would just recommend that for any school that is trying to look into this, please make sure you explore all your options. And all of us are interested in helping you make these succeed. The ACHP is a member of the White House Initiative on HBCUs. And we belong to a group focused on history, heritage. What is it, Lynn? Arts, humanities, and history. And we give a seminar every year at the National Conference for HBCUs. And it's about finding careers, but they also talk about all the funding opportunities that are available. So please just get in touch with one of us if you're interested in finding out more. Molly, would you be willing to put your email in the chat?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Also went ahead and linked a couple of the grant funding sources that I referenced.
Great, thank you.
Dana, did you have something to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to remember is when we're doing all this, save everything, y'all. We have several HBCUs that are on the brink of closing. Some that have been integrated into PWIs, or primarily white institutions. I'm thinking right now of Hines Community College taking over Utica. And when they did that, Utica lost a lot of their information, and they're trying to restore it all. And went over there to help them with their archive. Y'all, save your information, or save the information, whichever place you can get it and put it somewhere, because when you write these grants, you're going to have to know a little bit about the history of the facility, the building that you're working on. You're going to have to really have your ducks in a row when you do this. It's not always as simple as it's said. You have to have some information, and certainly I will be glad to help you in any way with that. Anybody?
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of similar questions. I'll just, we'll go through them. Macon, Georgia has an HBCU that lasted almost a year, and there's a historical marker, but Shakita would like more to be done to have it recognized nationally. How does she start this process? Does anybody have an answer about historical markers?
That's
Those
usually
are
handled by the
usually
state.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Okay.
usually handled by your state. In Alabama, it's the Alabama Historical Commission. They will help you make an application for it, and they will provide a marker. You have to write it up. You have to write up the verbiage for the marker. We've done here at Tuskegee, we've done 11 and created a civil rights trail here at Tuskegee. But yeah, you're going to have to do that, and it's not a big deal. Oftentimes they'll pay for it. Your historical commissions will pay for it as well.
I think the question was about additional amplification about the history of this HBCU. I believe, if I remember correctly, there is already a marker. And I do think that there would be lots of options to explore. And I think probably, Dana, one of the first things that would need to be explored is how to get funding, to think about maybe raising awareness or social media campaigns or whatever it may be. So funding might be necessary to try to really amplify the story of this HBCU. Molly, any other thoughts from you?
Historical research is always a free way to begin building on the information about the site and celebrating it. And there's also really great ways to publish that information online. The Trust, I keep going back to the Trust because that's where I work, but we have a really great column that we publish stories about important historic sites. That might be one avenue. There's probably statewide blogs that talk about history. I'm thinking some HBCU history sites that might be interested in somebody contributing information about that. And that's a good way just through research to begin celebrating this site and getting the word out about it.
And remember, you don't just have one marker, okay? Every site has somebody or something that happened there that's pertinent. If there's a civil rights event that happened there, a marker celebrating that civil rights event or that civil rights worker, or maybe some famous sports person that was there. Those kind of things need to be taken into consideration. And then you can get it out to your local newspapers, and you'll be surprised how the community will back you on some of this stuff when you go further than just the overall picture of the HBCU. Get down to the specifics.
And the National Park Service has a great website for the National Register of Historic Places. You can just Google that, and or maybe our interns can put the link to the National Register website in the chat. So that can get you started. Taisha asked, there are so many HBCUs that have buildings in decline. How much of the responsibility of maintaining these buildings is on the state and federal government, especially if it is a public HBCU? Dr. Warrick, do you have any insights?
Well, I think the ones that probably are not being preserved are probably private. And so, I think it goes back to just going and gathering the research on the history, what organization initiated it. Like Stillman was founded by the Presbyterian Church. Many of the privates were founded by churches. And so, it's a way to kind of look at those church leadership organizations but going back to the original owner who has the title to the property is so key, because you're going to have permission from the owner before you can write a grant, before you can get any resources or even speak on his behalf. You're going to have a committee or a group together that say, we want to do that. And every city and county have historic preservation organizations. So, I would start there and try to see who's the city preservation historic committee in your community, and ask them, do they know who owns it, or, if there's any action been taken previously, so that, it may be part of that entity as well, or the city, the county, all of those have historic offices.
All right. And Butch asked a really interesting question about citizen, local community buy-in to HBCU preservation. Do you feel that the preservation of buildings can occur without local citizen buy-in after giving the pitch to City Council and no interest to preserve? Or would it be viewed as outsiders meddling? Did you seek local buy-in first?
Yeah, I think you have to be engaged in the local historic preservation activities. So, you can join the National Trust, and then that has more of a national focus, but they do have regional meetings and other types of webinars. You can join your local conservation societies or historic preservation program societies. Like in Tuscaloosa, there's the Tuscaloosa County Historic Preservation Association. It's an organization. They have a board, they have members, they do fundraising, they manage historic sites. So it's, those types of organizations I think exist, and then they will facilitate the communication with the council. It's really helpful if you have local community support before you go to the city council and nobody else knows about it or who you are, but they know those organizations, and those organization members are usually prominent people in the community.
We've also used the Rotary Club. They have been very active in helping us here on campus. So local clubs can be important. The Rotary Club helped us with a little over $100,000 in putting in a monument here on campus to highlight a building that we have that was the first building bought and paid for with funds from the March of Dimes. And so we were able to utilize that and get some pretty good funding. So, again, researching what buildings are important, what events were important, and then focusing on people that can help from that standpoint. You'll be surprised what you'll find.
And I would add, don't underestimate the power of engaging students in this process. They can amplify the message. They can be the boots on the ground that's spreading the word in the community. And as we found through our digital documentation fellowship, they can actually be a part of the physical work in saving these places.
Mm-hmm. There's another resource that I just thought of listening to Dana is each municipality and state have community development block grant funds, what we call CDBG funds. And each city or community has their own process for applying for this kind of funding. And historic preservation projects can certainly be used those funds could be used for these types of projects as well.
Lynn, we're getting close. You got to power through these questions, my friend.
So, Dana, you've been asked what your favorite historical site on Tuskegee is. What is your favorite?
My favorite site on the campus is the Infantile Paralysis Center and the Johnny Andrew Memorial Hospital, because it's the first hospital in the state of Alabama for African Americans. It was run by African Americans, staffed by African Americans. The first female doctor in the state of Alabama, first certified female doctor in the state of Alabama was our doctor, and she worked at our first hospital.
Wow.
So the National Medical Association began here, which is the black wing of the AMA, began here. So much went on here at the Johnny Andrew Memorial Hospital and it continues to be a leader in providing bio training, etc. So yeah, by far, this is my favorite building.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Welch asked, does the Hope Crew, ACHP, or any of the panelists have information for community groups dealing with court cases to stop the desecration of burial grounds? And she's thinking specifically of the Moses Cemetery in Bethesda, Maryland. Anybody have
This
any
is
thoughts?
such a hot topic right now, isn't it, Molly? Do you want to answer that question? And also maybe talk a little bit about Senator Brown's proposed act, which I don't think has been voted on yet, but
I don't know that I'm the one to speak on that, but I will say that there was just a webinar less than 2 weeks ago on legal recourse that people have that they can take when burial grounds are threatened. It's a really great resource. There were so many great panelists there with really practical advice. As we're chatting, I'll see if I can go back through the archives and find a link to that. But that would be a great first step. But as Susan mentioned, there's wonderful legislation right now to protect burial grounds, and specifically Black burial grounds, and those that have been neglected and overlooked for years. And again, I don't think I'm the one to speak on that, but it's promising, and it looks like it's moving forward with great support.
I will say that Senator Brown has a bipartisan African-American Burial Grounds Preservation Act that is on the table. And I believe it's actually headed to President Biden I apologize, but unfortunately I can't keep my lights on because I just got a message that my computer is dying. But so there are things at a much higher level that are being done right now, but that's a great question. And I wish we had more answers for you on that.
Do we have time for one more question, Susan?
We do.
We're at time, everybody, but any questions that are left unanswered, we can try to get the answers to you directly. But I think that might wrap it up, Susan. We're at time.
Okay, well then let me just say before my computer dies that I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists today. What a great job that was. And I know everyone appreciates hearing from all of you. I also want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. And please stay in touch with us on social media so you know about upcoming conferences. And there's going to be a pop-up survey when you get off today. We would really appreciate it if you would spend just a couple minutes looking at it, because it really helps us to make sure that we are shaping our future webinars to your needs and your interests. And I think that's it. Register for our next webinar, but I would like to quickly say that I want to especially thank the group from the ACHP who puts this marvelous set of webinars together, Lynn Richmond, and two marvelous interns we have from the, Lynn, what's the name of it? The State Department internships.
Virtual Student Federal Service.
Thank you. And that would be Jasmine Lopez and also Ryan Smith. So ladies, you might as well come on and take a bow. Great work to all of you, and thank you so much. We look forward to seeing everybody at our next webinar. Thank you for joining.